The city never sleeps, and neither does the guilt. Picture this: a man standing at the edge of a rooftop in Manhattan, staring out at the skyline he once owned. The lights of New York City glittering below him like 1,000 promises that were never kept. He's not there to jump. He's there because it's the only place quiet enough to hear his own heartbeat. And tonight, his heartbeat sounds like a name. A name that doesn't belong to him anymore. A name that was never really his to begin with. Her name is Kendra Jordan. And the question you need to ask yourself before we go any further is this: if the person you loved most in this world had to choose between your happiness and their own life, what would that choice cost everyone left behind? Hold that question, because by the time this story is over, it will mean something entirely different to you. Before we go any further, if stories like this one move you, if they keep you up at night thinking about love and loyalty and the terrible price of both, hit that like button, subscribe to this channel, and share this video with someone who understands that the deepest wounds are never the ones you can see. This community is built on stories that matter, and this one matters more than most. Now, let's go back to the beginning. New York City, 1995. The kind of New York that tourists didn't visit and travel magazines didn't photograph. The New York of back alleys behind Koreatown, of underground card rooms in Flushing, of unmarked restaurants in the Bronx, where the private dining rooms had thicker walls than the public ones. Yes, such New York that ran on favors and fear and the particular kind of loyalty that can only be forged between men who have survived things they never speak about aloud. In this New York, two men grew up as brothers without sharing a drop of blood. Cho Young-seok was the son of a Korean immigrant who had come to America with $40 and a willingness to do whatever it took. His father had started in laundry. He had graduated to loan collection. By the time Young-seok was 12 years old, his father ran half the gambling operations in Koreatown and was owed favors by people whose names you whispered rather than spoke. Young-seok inherited his father's sharpness and his mother's hunger, a dangerous combination. He was charismatic in the way that fire is charismatic. You couldn't look away from him, and if you got too close, you got burned. By the time he was 25, he didn't just work for the organization his father had built. He was the organization. Cho Young-seok ran New York's most powerful Korean crime syndicate with the kind of quiet authority that never needed to raise its voice because everyone in the room already knew exactly what he was capable of. Lucas Rivers was something else entirely. He had come up from nothing, from a housing project in the South Bronx that the city had forgotten existed. Where Young-seok had inherited a kingdom, Lucas had clawed his way out of a pit. Where Young-seok moved through the world with a prince's certainty, Lucas moved with the careful precision of someone who had learned early that every step could be a trap. He was taller, quieter, and in many ways kinder than the man the world had made him into. He had met Young-seok at 16 in a youth detention center in Queens, two teenagers from different worlds thrown into the same concrete room by the same broken system. And something between them had clicked immediately, not because they were alike, but because they were exactly what the other one needed. Young-seok gave Lucas access to a world with structure and protection. Lucas gave Young-seok something far rarer, someone who told him the truth. By their late 20s, Lucas Rivers was Cho Young-seok's most trusted lieutenant, his closest advisor, and the only man on earth whose loyalty Young-seok never once questioned. These were two men who would have walked through fire for each other. And then came Kendra Jordan. Kendra Jordan was a dancer. Not the kind that performed on Broadway stages for packed houses and standing ovations, though she had the talent for it. She danced at a club called Mirage in Midtown Manhattan, a high-end establishment where the clientele wore suits that cost more than most people's rent and where the champagne was real, and the conversations were not. She had grown up in Harlem, the daughter of a jazz musician father who had given her rhythm and a librarian mother who had given her language, and somehow the combination had produced a woman of extraordinary depth and surface beauty both. The kind of woman who could make a room full of powerful men feel simultaneously elevated and humbled just by walking through the door. Kendra had been in New York her whole life, and yet somehow she and Young Seok had never crossed paths until the night his business partner hosted a private event at Mirage, and Kendra was performing in the main room. Young Seok had not planned to stay. He rarely enjoyed these events. They were performances of their own, exercises in power and visibility that he endured rather than savored. But he had looked up from his drink at exactly the right moment, and Kendra had been mid-movement across the stage, and something in the way she moved, with complete and total inhabitation of herself, like she existed nowhere else in the world except precisely where she was, had stopped him cold. Cho Young-seok was not a man who was easily stopped by anything. He had asked about her. He had been told her name. He had done something he almost never did. He had waited. Not demanded. Not commanded. He had simply waited near the edge of the room until the performance ended and found a natural moment to introduce himself. And when he finally spoke to her, he had not led with who he was or what he controlled. He had said simply, "You dance like someone who's had her heart broken before," and learned something important from it. Kendra had looked at him for a long moment and said, "Most people don't notice that." He had said, "Most people aren't looking for the right things." And that was the beginning. What Young-seok did not know, could not have known, was that Lucas Rivers had met Kendra Jordan 3 months earlier at a mutual friends gathering in Harlem. Lucas had seen her across a crowded apartment talking animatedly about James Baldwin with a group of people who could barely keep up with her, and he had been quietly, completely undone. They had talked for 4 hours that night. They had exchanged numbers. They had gotten coffee twice, then dinner once. And they had been circling something genuine and tender and still unnamed, when Kendra had appeared at Mirage and Young-seok had entered her world like a force of nature. Lucas had never told Young-seok about Kendra. There had been nothing concrete to tell. Nothing had been declared. Nothing had been formalized. But in his chest, in the deep private chambers of who he actually was underneath everything the streets had built around him, Lucas Rivers knew. He knew what he felt. And then he watched his best friend fall in love with the same woman, and he did what a man of his character was almost inevitably going to do. He stepped back. He said nothing. He buried it. He told himself that his feelings were his problem, not anyone else's. And he smiled at Young-seok's happiness, and he treated Kendra with the warm, respectful friendliness of a man who feels nothing more than goodwill, and he locked the rest of it somewhere very deep inside himself and lost the key on purpose. Young-seok pursued Kendra with everything he had, not materially, though he spared nothing on that front either, but emotionally, with an intensity that she found both magnetic and slightly terrifying. He was not a man accustomed to not getting what he wanted, and what he wanted was her. Not just her presence, not just her time. He wanted her in the particular consuming way that a man wants something he suspects might be the one thing capable of saving him from himself. He needed her the way an open wound needs suturing, urgently, desperately, with the clear understanding that without it, something essential was going to bleed out. Kendra was not naive about who Young-seok was. In New York's underworld-adjacent circles, his name carried weight. She knew what his suits were paid for with. She knew what the men around him did for a living. She was not a woman who could claim ignorance, and she was not a woman who sought it. She had had a long and complicated internal argument with herself about whether a man like Cho Young-seok could be someone she was genuinely getting into. And then she had realized, somewhere around the 4th or 5th time they'd been together, that the argument was already over. That she had already made a decision she hadn't consciously acknowledged yet. That he had gotten under her skin in a way she couldn't explain to anyone who hadn't experienced it themselves. The way a person who is entirely sure of themselves can make you feel entirely seen, because there is no performance in the seeing. Young-seok looked at Kendra Jordan and did not see a woman to be managed or decorated or displayed. He saw a person of ferocious interior life, and that precise thing, was what undid her. She said yes when he asked her to be with him exclusively. She said yes again, in a different and far more serious context a year later, when he took her to a restaurant in the West Village that he had rented out entirely for the evening, and got down on one knee in a room full of candlelight, and told her that whatever kind of man he had been before, he wanted to be a different one now. For her. With her. She said yes. Lucas Rivers stood beside Young Seok at the engagement dinner 3 days later and raised his glass and gave a toast that made Kendra cry, and made Young Seok laugh, and made several hardened men in expensive clothing suddenly find something very interesting to examine on the floor. It was a beautiful toast. Sincere, warm, perfectly crafted. Every word of it was genuine. And it cost Lucas something that nobody in that room understood. 6 months before the wedding, something happened that changed everything. A rival organization, an alliance of Russian and Italian interests that had been encroaching on the syndicate's operations in Brooklyn and the Bronx, made a move. They hit 3 of Young Seok's operations in a single night. 2 of his men were killed. One of his largest revenue sources was burned to the ground. And the message was unmistakable. They were coming for him, and they were not afraid of what that meant. Young Seok's response was calculated and swift. He called a sit-down with his senior people. He consolidated his most vulnerable operations. He reached out to allied organizations in Chicago and LA to signal that he was not isolated and that any attempt to take him down would have cascading consequences. And he sent Lucas, his most trusted, his most capable, to negotiate with a group of intermediaries in Los Angeles who had connections to both sides of the conflict and might be able to broker a peace. Lucas flew to Los Angeles, and then the intermediaries were compromised. And then there was an ambush. And then there was a car on a freeway outside Compton that caught fire, and 2 of Lucas's men were found dead in it afterward. And Lucas himself was found nowhere. No body. No signal. No contact. For 11 days, Cho Young-seok heard nothing from his best friend. For 11 days, he ran on almost no sleep, directing searches, pulling every string he had access to across 6 cities, and quietly preparing himself for news that he was not sure he would survive receiving. On the 12th day, the searches came back empty. Lucas Rivers was declared dead. What Young Seok did in the weeks after that is difficult to describe with clinical accuracy because it was not a clinical experience. He went through it the way you go through a hurricane, not by understanding it, but by surviving it. He maintained his business because he had no choice. He made the necessary decisions, attended the necessary meetings, projected the necessary authority. But at night, he sat in his penthouse apartment on the 53rd floor of a building in Midtown and looked out over the city and felt the specific hollow ache of a loss that has no ceremony. Lucas was not someone he could eulogize publicly. Their friendship existed in a world that didn't do funerals, that didn't do grief, that moved forward because stopping meant dying. Kendra held him through it. She didn't try to fix it, didn't try to replace what was missing, didn't offer empty words about time healing things. She simply stayed. She was there in the mornings, and there in the evenings, and there in the long, silent spaces in between, and her presence was not a cure. Nothing is a cure. But it was the thing that kept him tethered. He looked at her and remembered that there was still something in his life that was real and clean and worth protecting. They moved the wedding forward, not out of desperation, but out of clarity. What is the point, Young Seok had said quietly one evening, of waiting for a better time when we already know that time can be taken from you in a single night? They were married at a private ceremony in a rented estate in the Hudson Valley. 60 people, no press, no announcement. Kendra wore white with gold. Young Seok wore a dark charcoal suit with a single white flower in the lapel that had been Lucas's favorite. He had put it there without telling anyone why. The honeymoon was Young Seok's grand gesture to the life he wanted them to have. He took Kendra to Paris first, to a suite at a hotel on the Rue de Rivoli that looked out over the Tuileries garden, where they ate croissants in bed in the mornings and walked along the Seine at night. And for the first time in more years than he could count, Young-seok Cho did not feel like a crime boss or a target or a man with enemies. He felt like a person, an ordinary person in love, walking beside a woman who made him feel ordinary in the best possible way. They went from Paris to Venice, where they rode gondolas through narrow waterways and drank Prosecco at a rooftop bar, and got genuinely, happily lost in the labyrinth of alleyways around the Rialto market on a Tuesday morning. Kendra bought a handmade leather journal from a stall near the bridge and wrote in it every day. Young-seok watched her write and thought that he was watching someone process joy in real time, and the thought made him simultaneously proud and afraid. Proud because he had helped create the conditions for that joy. Afraid because something in him had never fully learned how to trust happiness without waiting for it to be taken away. They went to Rome. They went to the Amalfi Coast. They drove along cliff-top roads above the turquoise Mediterranean with the windows down and music playing, and Kendra put her hand out the window into the rushing air and closed her eyes and smiled, and Young-seok looked at her sideways and thought, I would burn the entire world down to protect this specific moment. They ended in Switzerland, in a chalet above Zurich, where the mornings were white and cold and impossibly quiet. This was where the first crack appeared. It was small, almost imperceptible. Kendra had been writing in her journal on the balcony wrapped in a thick blanket, and Young-seok had come out to bring her coffee, and he had glanced, not intentionally, not with any suspicious intent, at the page she was writing on. He had seen a name, a single name, written in the margin of a journal entry. Lucas. He had not reacted. He had set the coffee down and gone back inside, and stood very still in the middle of the kitchen for approximately 3 minutes, telling himself that it meant nothing. That she was grieving too. That Lucas had been important to both of them. That the presence of that name in her private writing did not mean what the cold, frightened animal part of his brain was desperately suggesting it might mean. He had almost convinced himself, but something had shifted anyway, in the way that things shift in a relationship when a question forms that cannot be asked directly, when a doubt enters a space that had previously been entirely secure. He loved Kendra completely. He believed she loved him. And yet, something about the way she had been writing, the particular quality of stillness on her face in that moment, the way she had looked staring out over the Swiss Alps, as if she were not entirely present in Switzerland at all, but somewhere else, with someone else in mind. He said nothing. He poured the coffee. He went back out and sat beside her, and they watched the mountains together, and everything was fine, and nothing was fine, and the trip ended 3 days later, and they came home to New York. Lucas Rivers was not dead. He had been wounded in the ambush outside Compton, badly enough that he had been unconscious for 4 days in a safe house managed by an allied organization that had pulled him out of the burning car before the fire reached the cabin. He had spent 11 days unable to make contact because his phone had been destroyed in the fire, and his contact protocols had been compromised, and the people hiding him were cautious to the point of paranoia about communication. By the time he had recovered enough to reach back to New York, 2 things had happened simultaneously. He had learned that Young-seok had called off the searches and declared him dead, and he had learned that Young-seok and Kendra had moved forward with the wedding. Lucas had sat with this information for a very long time. He had thought about it the way a man thinks about something when he is lying in a safe house bed in California, with cracked ribs and a graze wound along his left shoulder, and nothing to do for hours except be honest with himself. He thought about Kendra. He thought about what he had felt for her and what he had chosen to do with that feeling. He thought about Young-seok and what that friendship meant and what it had always meant and what it would continue to mean if he went back. He thought about the version of events in which he simply did not return, in which Lucas Rivers stayed dead for everyone's sake, including his own. And then he thought about the fact that the man he considered a brother was running an operation with a serious threat hanging over it, and that without Lucas, certain alliances were fragile, certain operations were vulnerable, and that whatever his personal complications were, his loyalty was not a thing he was capable of abandoning. He came back to New York 7 months after the wedding. He knocked on the door of Young-seok's office in a building in Koreatown that looked, from the outside, like an unremarkable import-export company. And when the door opened and Young-seok saw his face, what happened next was not the restrained professional acknowledgement of two men in their position. Young-seok crossed the room in 3 steps and held him. Held him the way men hold each other when they have been genuinely broken by a loss and then given back something they had already buried. Neither of them spoke for a long time. They didn't need to. When they finally separated, Young-seok had looked at him with eyes that were red at the edges and said, "I'm going to need a week before I can be angry at you for scaring me like that." And Lucas had said, "Take 2." And they had both laughed. And it was genuine. And it was one of the last truly uncomplicated moments they would share for a very long time. Kendra found out Lucas was alive from Young-seok himself, over dinner, the evening after his return. She had gone very still when he told her. Her fork had lowered to the plate. She had looked at Young-seok and said slowly, "Lucas is alive." Not as a question, as something she was testing in her mouth, as something that required saying out loud before it could be made real. Young-seok, watching her, noticed the stillness, filed it, said nothing. She met Lucas for the first time since his return 3 days later, at a gathering at their apartment. She had walked in, and he had been standing near the window, and for a fraction of a second, so brief that anyone not specifically watching for it would have missed it entirely, something had passed across both of their faces simultaneously. Something that was not surprise, something that was recognition of a different order entirely. A kind of private seismic event that lasted perhaps half a breath before both of them, each independently and yet in perfect synchronization, locked it away behind their normal faces. Young-seok saw it. He didn't know exactly what he had seen, but he had spent 15 years in an industry where reading the room was the difference between walking out of a meeting and not walking out of a meeting. And he had the particular animal sensitivity of a man who has learned to detect the thing beneath the thing. He had seen something. He didn't know what to do with it yet, so he poured everyone drinks and laughed at something Lucas said and let the evening proceed. But he started watching, carefully, the way he had been trained to watch. And the problem with being very good at reading people is that eventually you read something you cannot unread. Over the following months, Young-seok observed things he could not quite assemble into a coherent picture, but could not dismiss either. He noticed that Kendra was more careful around Lucas than around anyone else, not uncomfortable, but careful, in the way you are careful around something you are consciously protecting. He noticed that Lucas, for his part, he was always slightly more formal with Kendra than with anyone else in the room, which was strange given that his closest friend was her husband and they should have naturally been familiar. He noticed small things, the way their conversations, when he entered a room mid-sentence, had a particular quality of completeness to them, like exchanges between people who have a long shared vocabulary that the rest of the world is not privy to. The way Kendra's journal, which she now kept in the nightstand drawer rather than on the desk where it used to sit, had gotten thicker. He read it one morning when she was in the shower. He read 3 pages before he put it down. He put it down carefully. He set it back in the drawer at the exact angle he had found it. He went and sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the floor, because what he had read was not incriminating in a technical sense. Kendra had not documented a betrayal. She had not written about actions. She had written about feelings, about the strange, painful experience of having someone return from the dead and having to perform normalcy around something that did not feel normal. She had written about how unfair it was that the heart doesn't consult you before it decides things. She had written a single line, one line near the bottom of the last page he had read, that dismantled something in him so quietly and completely that he sat with the rubble of it for a long time before he understood what had just collapsed. She had written, "I chose right. I know I chose right. I just need to stop wondering what might have been if the choice had been different." He didn't confront her. Not immediately. And he had been in dangerous negotiations his entire adult life. He knew that information, when handled correctly, was more powerful than reaction. He let weeks pass. He watched. He waited. He kept loving her, kept being her husband, kept being present in their home. And the watching cost him a piece of himself every day that he did it. Because the thing about watching the person you love is that even when you're looking for evidence of something painful, you keep seeing all the reasons you loved them in the first place, and the two things happening simultaneously is one of the most specific and particular forms of suffering that exists in the human experience. He confronted Lucas first. He called him to his office on a Tuesday afternoon and sent everyone else away and locked the door and sat across from him for a very long time before speaking. And when he spoke, he didn't ask a question. He simply said, "Tell me the truth." Lucas looked at him, and then Lucas, who had been in that moment, by any reasonable external measure, cornered, did not perform innocence, did not construct a defense. He looked at his best friend, and he closed his eyes for a moment, and when he opened them again, he said, "Before you and Kendra were together, I had feelings for her. I never acted on them. I stepped back because you were already in love with her, and there was no version of that situation where I chose anything other than your happiness. I have never touched her. I never will. And I'm telling you this right now because you are the only person in my life I will not lie to." Young Seok listened. The room was very quiet. He said, "And Kendra?" Lucas said, "You should ask Kendra." "I'm asking you." A long silence, then, "She's your wife. She chose you. She has never said or done anything that is a betrayal of that choice. What she feels or doesn't feel in her own private interior life is not something I can speak to, and it's not something that belongs to this conversation." Young Seok stood up. He went to the window. He stood there for what felt like a very long time, looking out over Koreatown, over the city that he had built his entire life inside of. Then he said, quietly, "Get out of my office." Lucas got up. He walked to the door. He stopped with his hand on the knob and said, without turning around, "I'm sorry, Young. I'm sorry for all of it. Not for what I felt, but for what it's costing you." And then he left. Young Seok went home that evening and made dinner. He made a Korean dish his mother had taught him. The kind of meal you only make when you are trying to locate yourself in something familiar. He set the table. He opened wine. And when Kendra came home and saw the effort and sat down across from him, he looked at her and he said, "I need you to talk to me. Really talk to me. Not as my wife or as someone protecting my feelings. As the person who knows me better than anyone. I need the truth." And Kendra, who was not a woman who hid from hard things, looked at her husband across the dinner table in the home they had built together, and she told him the truth. Not all of it, but enough. She told him that before him, there had been something with Lucas that she had not known what to call yet, because it had not been named before it ended. She told him that she had chosen Young Seok, fully, consciously, completely, not as a consolation, not as a default. She had chosen him because she loved him, because he had seen her, because what they had was real and had weight and had meaning. She told him that the complexity of her feelings was something she was managing internally, and that it had never been and would never be allowed to become something external, something that existed between her and Lucas in a way that diminished what existed between her and Young Seok. She said, "I am here. I am your wife. I am not going anywhere. But I am also a person, and people are not simple. And I will not pretend to you that I am simpler than I am." He sat with that for a long time. Then he said, "Do you love him?" And Kendra, whose honesty was both her greatest quality and, in this moment, the most painful thing in the room, said, "I love you. That is what I know. That is what I'm sure of." Which was not the same as saying no, and they both knew it. He nodded. He poured more wine. They ate dinner. And the thing that had been between them since Switzerland sat on the table between them like an additional guest, acknowledged now, formally introduced, impossible to uninvite. The weeks that followed were the quietest catastrophe. Nothing dramatic. No screaming, no shattering. Just the particular cold distance that settles between two people when the truth has been told and the truth has not resolved anything. Young-seok moved through his days. He ran his operations. He slept beside his wife. He loved her still. That part had not changed, and if anything, it had gotten more desperate in the way that love gets desperate when it starts to feel like it is losing something it cannot name. But there was a wall now. Glass. Not stone. He could see through it perfectly. He just couldn't touch. Lucas had not come to the apartment since the conversation in the office. He communicated with Young-seok professionally, carefully, through intermediaries when possible. He was clearly trying to give space, trying to allow whatever process needed to happen without his presence complicating it further. This was, in its way, another act of selflessness, and Young-seok, who saw it clearly, hated it a little. It is easier to be angry at someone who makes themselves easy to hate. It was Kendra who finally broke the glass wall. Not intentionally. She had left her journal open on the kitchen counter. A mistake. Or perhaps not entirely a mistake. The way we sometimes allow ourselves to be known through carelessness when we have run out of courage for directness. Young-seok had come into the kitchen and seen it and read a single page without meaning to, without even deciding to. It was already done before he chose to do it. She had written that morning about feeling trapped between two kinds of love and two kinds of loyalty. She had written about the specific grief of loving someone you cannot have. She had written about guilt. She had written about Young-seok with tenderness, with real, documented, eye-evidence tenderness. And she had written about the fear that loving him was something she might eventually be taken from by her own divided heart. She had written, "I am afraid that in trying to be fair to everyone, I am slowly destroying everyone, including myself." He closed the journal. He sat down on the kitchen floor, literally sat on the floor, his back against the cabinet. And he stayed there for a long time. And in that moment, Cho Young-seok, who had never been afraid of anything the world could throw at him, who had faced rivals and threats and losses and the specific violence of the life he had chosen, was simply a man sitting on a kitchen floor, afraid. Afraid of losing her. Afraid of what her honesty was pointing toward. Afraid of what it meant that the two people he loved most in the world had been quietly, honorably, devastatingly in love with each other before either of them had ever been in love with him. He called Lucas that night, not to the office. He told him to come to the rooftop of the building where they had once, as younger men, climbed illegally and drunk cheap beer and looked out over the city and talked about the futures they were going to build. He told him to come alone. He told him to come at midnight. Lucas came. They stood at the edge of the roof for a long time without speaking, looking out at the skyline. The city below them was relentless. Lights and traffic and the ambient roar of 8 million lives being lived simultaneously, indifferent to any one of them. Young-seok spoke first. He said, "I've been thinking about the toast you gave at the engagement dinner." Lucas said nothing. "You told everyone that I was the kind of man who deserved to be happy. Do you remember that?" "I remember." "Did you believe it when you said it?" Lucas turned to look at him. "Yes, I still believe it." "Then I need you to tell me something. Truthfully. Not as my lieutenant. Not as someone protecting me or protecting her or protecting yourself. As someone who has known me since we were 16 years old in a room we didn't choose. Do you love her?" The city roared below them. A siren somewhere. A helicopter crossing the river. The wind at this height was cold and constant. Lucas said, "Yes." Young-suk closed his eyes, nodded slowly. "Does she love you?" "I think there is something. I think she has managed it and contained it and chosen you above it in every moment that it has mattered. I think the choice she made is real. I think she means it. But feelings don't obey choices. You know that." Young-suk opened his eyes. He looked at the skyline. He said, "You know what the worst part of all of this is? I'm not even angry at you. I keep trying to be. I keep reaching for it and it's not there. And that makes everything worse somehow." Lucas said, "I know. What do we do with this? Seriously, what does a person do with this?" Lucas was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "I don't know. But I know it's not your problem to solve. It's mine." Young-seok looked at him. "What does that mean?" Lucas said, "It means you should go home. To your wife. Who loves you." He paused. "I'll figure out the rest." They stood there for another few minutes. Then Young-seok left. He did not know, going down the stairs, that this was the last real conversation they would ever have. The call came at 4 a.m. Kendra answered it. She sat up in bed in the darkness and listened, and her face went completely white. She looked at Young-suk, who had woken at the first ring, and she said, in a voice that had lost all its sound, "It's Lucas." He had gone from the rooftop to his apartment in the Bronx. He had left a letter on his kitchen table addressed to Young-suk, and another addressed to Kendra. He had taken a bottle of scotch from the cabinet and a glass, and sat in the chair by the window that looked out over his neighborhood, and he had made a decision that was, in his mind, the final and most complete version of the thing he had been doing since the very beginning: stepping aside, removing himself from the equation, choosing one last time and irrevocably from the happiness of the two people he loved over the inconvenient fact of his own existence. He had been found by a neighbor. He had been rushed to a hospital. He was alive, barely, when they arrived. He died at 6:17 in the morning. The letter he left for Young-suk was 11 lines long. It said, among other things, that the 15 years of their friendship had been the greatest thing in his life, and that there was no version of the future he could construct in which he was not either a source of pain for Young-suk or a source of pain for Kendra, or both, and that he had decided this particular removal was the cleanest solution he could find. He said he was sorry for being too cowardly to find a better one. He said that Young-suk deserved a life unencumbered by this specific complication. He said that he loved him in the way that brothers love each other, without conditions or limits or end. The letter to Kendra, which Young-seok read later with her permission, said only 4 sentences. It said that he was grateful she had existed in his life, even briefly and even at the margins. It said that she had done everything right. It said that the choice she had made was the correct one, and that he had never doubted it. And it said, "Be happy." Just that. Be happy. Young-seok stood on the rooftop of his building in Manhattan 3 nights after the funeral. The same rooftop, the same skyline. He stood exactly where Lucas had stood, and he looked out over the city that had made both of them and unmade one of them. And he felt the weight of what was missing with a completeness that defied articulation. He had lost his best friend. Not to a rival, not to a bullet or a betrayal or the inherent dangers of the life they had both chosen. He had lost him to love, to the particular cruelty of love when it lands in the wrong geometry, when it is felt by the right people at the wrong time, when there is no version of the map that gets everyone home safely. He thought about what Lucas had said on this same roof, that it wasn't Young-seok's problem to solve, that Lucas would figure out the rest. And he had. God, he had. Kendra found him on the rooftop. She had known where to look. She stood beside him and did not touch him and did not speak, and they both looked out at the city together in silence for a long time. And in that silence was everything: the grief, the guilt, the love, the loss, the terrible, complicated truth that no one in this story had been a villain, one that everyone had tried to be good, and that trying to be good is sometimes catastrophically insufficient. Finally, Young-seok spoke. He said, "He loved you." Kendra said, "I know." "He loved me too. I know that too." A long pause. "How do we carry this?" Kendra reached out and took his hand. His hand was cold from the night air. She held it until it wasn't. She said, "The same way he carried it, quietly and forward. There's no other direction." He looked at her, at this woman who was his wife, who was complicated and honest and present and real, who had sat with him through hurricane and grief and doubt and come out still standing beside him. He thought about Lucas's letter. Be happy. Just that. He thought that it was going to be a very long time before happy was something either of them were capable of, but that Lucas had given them that instruction not as a comfort, but as a directive, as one last act of authority from a man who had spent 15 years ensuring that the people he loved were taken care of. He squeezed her hand. The city roared below them, indifferent, eternal, relentless. 8 million lives going on without pause. Two of them stood at the edge of a rooftop and began, very slowly, the long work of going on. Some loves are straightforward. They begin and they grow and they are reciprocated and they build into something simple and beautiful and uncomplicated. Those are the easy ones, the ones that don't haunt you, the ones that don't cost anything except time and effort and ordinary vulnerability. And then there are the other ones. The ones that are felt in silence by three people who are all trying to be honorable and who are all, despite their best intentions, breaking each other anyway. The ones where nobody is the villain and the tragedy happens without a single act of malice. The ones that leave a rooftop empty and a letter on a kitchen table and a silence in the space where a voice used to be. Lucas Rivers walked into that silence willingly. He chose it the same way he had always chosen, completely, without half measures, with the full weight of who he was. He stepped aside one final time and in doing so, stepped into whatever comes after this. He left behind two people who loved him, who are learning to carry that love the way you carry something irreplaceable. Carefully, always, with both hands. If this story stayed with you, if it moved something in you that needed moving, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to this channel. Share it with someone who understands that the most devastating stories are the ones where everyone was trying to do the right thing. This community grows one shared story at a time, and stories like Lucas's deserve to be heard. The city never sleeps, and neither does the guilt. But sometimes, if you're very fortunate and very brave, you learn to sleep beside it anyway.